Hi, everybody. This is Dan Freeman from ALA Publishing. Welcome to AL Live. We are really glad to have you here today. We're going to be talking about RDA. And I want to introduce our panel. Unfortunately, it looks like we just lost someone. So I think Gordon just somehow got booted out, but he'll be back momentarily, I'm sure. So let me introduce our panel. I'll introduce Gordon, too, even though he's not here. First, I want to introduce James Hennelly, who's the managing editor for RDA Toolkit. Welcome, James.
Hello.
And I'd like to introduce Kathy Glennon. She's an RDA steering committee representative and an authorities and specialty cataloging unit head at the University of Maryland Libraries in College Park, Maryland. Welcome, Kathy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Glad to have you here. And Gordon Dunsire is the RDA steering committee chair. Welcome, Gordon.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, I'm going to let Jamie sort of begin the discussion here. So we'll just get going.
Hello, everyone. I am the managing editor of RDA Toolkit, so we're excited to have this conversation about RDA and what it is and where it's heading. I'm just going to kind of give a quick intro to what we're doing with RDA. And or what are the component parts of RDA, and then we'll kind of start digging into deeper about what RDA means for catalogers and for libraries. So I'm going to show real quick here a website, the RDA RSC. This is the steering committee that writes the RDA website. Let me share my screen here. I got to do that, don't I? It's part of the. There we go. So I'm going to share this website. Oops, put that down. And here you can see the RDA RSC RDA website. The RSC is the RDA steering committee, which writes RDA, and they have a nice little basic.
Jamie, sorry to cut in. I think you're sharing your email rather than.
I put down my email. It should be my.
Maybe it's just a couple steps behind. Sorry about that.
Are you seeing my screen now?
We still see your email. I think what you got to do is you got to click the share button again and make sure you select the web browser as the app.
I thought I did. All right, I'll try it one more time. Screen. Here, let me. There we go. Let me try it again. Where's my web browser? Here it is. Okay, I got it. I see what I did. Okay.
There we go.
Okay, here's the website. So it has a definition of RDA. RDA is a package of data elements, guidelines, instructions for creating library and cultural heritage resource metadata that are well formed according to international models for user-focused linked data applications. So that's kind of where I think we should start with, and we're going to talk about how what we have with RDA attempts to meet these goals of our definition of RDA. One of the steps towards meeting these goals is, of course, this website, which is at rda-rsc.org. This is where the steering committee promotes all of the business that it undertakes, including you can see proposals for changing RDA, et cetera, like that. Another key component is the RDA Toolkit site itself. This is probably the central component because this is where you go to get the instructions. If this is at rdatoolkit.org, if you click on Access RDA Toolkit, it'll take you to what I call the toolkit proper, where we have all the instructions listed here in kind of a classic workflow type order that is somewhat similar to what you used to see with AACR2. There are many different tools available on the toolkit as well that help you kind of introduce yourself to RDA and its structure. I think a couple other important pieces or components to the RDA puzzle are also the RDA registry, which I'll pull up real quick here. Where did it go on me? I lost my link. Okay, I know what I'll just go to the email address because I know that. Registry, RDA registry, there we go. So here's the RDA registry, and this contains all the component parts of RDA itself, the elements, the vocabularies, their definitions, etc. And here they're put together in a technical online kind of space that can be used by developers to develop, to build RDA applications and information that so people can build tools that will help catalogers. So we're trying to address, promote RDA both as not only as a tool for catalogers, but also a tool for the developers to make that RDA, the content that the RDA data available on a much wider basis. And then I'll just make one more comment. I want to point out the as far as training, initial training in RDA and implementation of RDA, probably one of the best resources to go to is the Catalogers Learning Workshop, which is put together by the Library of Congress. You can see it here. And the Catalogers Learning Workshop contains lots and lots of free information about training and implementation steps for RDA. So I really kind of want to get just these basic stuff out there for everyone to kind of know that they're available, etc. From there, I think we want to look at, well, how do you go about implementing RDA, and what are the key challenges for librarians in implementing RDA? And for answers to that, I'm going to turn to Kathy.
See what I get for volunteering to talk about something. First, I want to mention that RDA is not a display standard like ISBD is sometimes used in our catalogs, and it's not an encoding standard like MARC. Instead, it's flexible enough to work with a variety of display and encoding standards. So, unfortunately, RDA's true potential can't be fully realized in a MARC environment. This is in spite of the improvements that have been made to MARC 21 over the last several years in response to RDA fields. Fields and subfields have been added to improve granularity, but this is really mostly as a vision for how to get MARC data into a new environment rather than truly accommodating RDA data in MARC. So that's sort of the future, the interim steps now to move us to a future where we have something other than MARC. So RDA is implemented in different ways in different places. I noticed this morning on RDAL there was some correspondence about how do you do RDA in your institution. And most people, and this is true in my own institution as well, do a mix of RDA and AACR2 cataloging and maybe some other things as well. For us, and I think for many others, it's based on the quality of the copy that we find in the first place. Here, most of our original cataloging is done using RDA now, but for our copy catalogers, it's going to be based on what they find and how comfortable they are in using RDA to enhance the records. Sometimes we'll end up with a hybrid record. That's sort of standard policy within OCLC and our consortium and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging. All of that allows for these hybrid sort of RDA but sort of not RDA kinds of records. It doesn't worry me too much to continue adding some AACR2 records to our local database because we have millions of records, some of which are in AACR1, some of which are in AACR2, some are RDA. So continuing to add to the AACR2 records is not a major concern, although certainly as we transition and use RDA more, I would expect more records to start conforming fully to RDA, because once it becomes second nature, it's easier to change the records than to validate that they were correct under AACR2. So I think the key challenges librarians have had in facing RDA implementation is simply figuring out what's the same and what's different. And there, as Jamie pointed out, the Catalogers Learning Workshop is a great source to go to. The biggest challenge with using the resources there is that they are out of date. As soon as you put something in writing about what RDA says, it will become dated. So use those just with that grain of salt. RDA is a moving target. The RSC is continuing to make changes to RDA, improve it, modify it, sometimes in direct response to user expressed needs. So I myself went and checked on a presentation I was doing 2 years after the fact on the same subject elements in a RDA description, and it was about whether or not you supply the place of publication if it's not clear. So do you say Ontario, Canada, if it just says Ontario? And to confirm what I was going to say, I went back and looked at my other presentation, which said exactly the opposite. No, you never do this. And what was in my current presentation said, yes, you may do this. And in fact, that was something that had changed. So just keep that in mind when you use those older resources. They were correct at the time that they were done, but they may become out of date because, as I said, RDA is continuing to evolve.
Okay, so what do you think is the impact of RDA in a MARC environment? As catalogers are more and more, the information I get is that when you're cataloging in MARC, you're really just cataloging in MARC. And how does MARC affect RDA, and what can RDA be beyond that?
So RDA in MARC is sort of an imperfect implementation of RDA. I think a lot of catalogers were going ahead and adding some of the new fields and subfields in hopes that it will make a difference in the future. But in our current local systems, a lot of especially the new MARC fields are not being displayed or maybe not being indexed, and sometimes they look redundant, and we get pushback from our folks when they say, why am I doing this? It's the same thing over and over. And so we're trying to start a mindset where it's very easy for catalogers to just totally integrate their thinking about the cataloging standard and the encoding standard and the display standard into one thing and not sort of separate it out intellectually. It's very convenient for shortcut ways of communicating. We can communicate in code instead of saying the statement of responsibility. We can say 245 delimiter C, and people who know MARC know what that is. But it also boxes us in, and we're used to, if you're old enough, card catalog displays. We're used to our OPAC displays, and it's very hard to see how some of this additional coding that we put in, the new 33X fields for RDA content, carrier, and media type, how is that used? How is it useful? Displaying some of those codes or terms out to the public, such as unmediated or unspecified, really doesn't seem like that would be the most helpful for an end user. So it's getting across that mindset of, I know what this does in my local system, to let's make sure we're encoding data for the future and not for the limitations of what we're dealing with now.
Right. And how does, I know you've been part of the Janathons, and let me quickly define Janathons. Janathons are kind of a variation on a hackathon that the RDA development team created, and they're meant to kind of begin to experiment with that RDA outside of MARC and what it can be. And can you talk a little bit about your experience with the Janathons and where the direction they're kind of hinting at as far as what is possible with RDA?
Sure. The Janathons have been a very interesting exercise in taking a look at, mostly I think people are bringing in MARC records and then massaging them to be more pure RDA. The program that's used that runs behind the data that we're dealing with is called RIMF, RDA in many metadata formats, and it creates entity records that sort of look like MARC records but sort of don't look like MARC records, and clearly separate out manifestation information from expression information, for example. And it forces catalogers who are used to MARC to start really thinking in terms of RDA and RDA terminology rather than the shorthand that I mentioned earlier with the easy MARC fields, MARC tagging shorthands. And the links are there to RDA instructions if you need some guidance. But it's also really challenging. Sometimes you sort of know what piece of information you want to put in, but you don't really know what RDA calls it. Or you instantly think, oh, well, this has always been part of a MARC bibliographic record, therefore it should be a manifestation level piece of information, but actually something like includes index is an expression level record. So that you sometimes start thinking you're going to be inputting data in one thing and you can't find it because it doesn't belong there. One of the biggest challenges that we found in doing the Janeathons is that some of the RDA modeling isn't quite where it needs to be, especially in relation to series. And is that at a work level, an expression level, a manifestation level? What exactly are we talking about when we are series separate works that they have a, are they whole part relationships? I can have the same textual work in multiple series, but it could be exactly the same text. So that one of the benefits out of the Janeathons is that we've had hands-on folks working with things, thinking about things, and identifying areas where either RDA is lacking the guidance that's needed, or that we need to do more training so that people understand where to find these things and how they work. And Gordon's certainly been heavily involved in the Janeathons as well, so perhaps he has some other insights from that.
Yeah, yes, I think the Janeathons in general not only expose people to what RDA is really intended to look like and intended to do, but it also exposes weaknesses in RDA. We can't pretend that RDA is a complete set of instructions, because the underlying models on which it's based are still undergoing development, although we can now see the end of that development phase in front of us, and RDA will react accordingly. But it's great at the Janeathons to see catalogers actually experiencing what RDA is intended to do. And it really is something that you need to do rather than look at a presentation for or read a manual. Reading the toolkit doesn't really prepare you for what actually happens when you start describing things using RDA. So the Janeathons, I think, have been particularly important for that, and as I said, as a source of feedback to the RDA steering committee, and we are certainly taking on board the criticisms that, and the very constructive criticisms that tend to come out of Janeathons.
So, Gordon, as we kind of look at the Janeathons, I guess one of the things about the Janeathon is you're creating, using this new tool, working outside of MARC, and basically the data that you're creating is being saved in RDF or linked data. And linked data is something, obviously, a lot of people have been talking about with regard to cataloging going forward. Can you give us kind of an intro to linked data and how RDA relates to linked data?
Sure, linked data in 35 seconds.
Exactly.
Yeah, linked data is a lot of things. The simplest way I've currently got of explaining it is that it's basically an extension of ideas and techniques developed during the evolution of the World Wide Web, what's called the web of documents these days, which itself, of course, is built on the substructure of the internet. But that web of documents is being extended into what's called linked open data, or the semantic web, primarily to exploit the underlying machine infrastructure that's evolving. So fairly recently, over the past 2 years, we've had this idea of the web of machines. That is, more and more computers, which are very powerful in comparison with 20 years ago, are being linked together, and I'm including in that scope the smartphones that are in everybody's pocket. They are actually talking to each other, even if they appear to be in off mode. So they're all linked together, these machines, and this is an enormous amount of globally networked processing power. So taking the ideas about representing documents, that is text and other files on the World Wide Web, linked data takes the best of these techniques and matches them up to this ever-expanding, apparently, web of machines. And it does it by disaggregating metadata, descriptions about things, into atomic statements, which you may have heard are called triples. Triples are basically atomic statements about things. So I can say this thing has a certain aspect, or this thing is related to some other thing. And these triples, because they're disaggregations down to atomic level, exist in enormous quantities as a result. But they're at such a fine level of granularity, they also represent enormous potential for linking data together to be far more flexible in how applications get their information. So the enormous quantities of linked data that are envisaged will be taken care of by the enormous processing power that's evolving in parallel with them. So that's really what linked data is trying to do, is exploit the emerging global infrastructure of these networks in order to meet global needs for information retrieval, resource discovery. The two go hand in hand. As machines become smarter and get more interconnected, the humans using those machines expect to find their data from wherever and no longer confined by national borders, languages, or indeed any other barrier. So linked data is basically that. I could go on for the next 90 minutes or 90 days, but I think...
But how does that, so with that kind of linked data, and RDA, at least my understanding of it is that with RDA we're trying to bring library data into that linked data world, to create library-based data that fits that kind of well-formed concept of well-formed metadata that can be exchanged in that linked data world, right?
Yeah.
And RDA obviously is exploring that. I guess a lot of people also hear about BibFrame nowadays when they're talking about things happening in the cataloging world. Where does BibFrame fit in, and what's the relationship with RDA? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. BibFrame is another linked data initiative. It's intended, as far as I can tell, as a replacement for Mark 21, and Kathy's already mentioned that the existence of the Mark 21 format is now beginning to cause problems. It's certainly a key challenge for libraries, whether they're implementing RDA or indeed any other linked data approach to things. So BibFrame is a replacement for Mark 21, a kind of linked data replacement for Mark 21. But I'm not sure. It seems to have scope beyond that, but it's unclear. It has claims that it's the future for library linked data, but I think it's too early to tell. So, in effect, BibFrame is based on the data that can be found in Mark 21 records as representative of the kinds of data that library systems require. But as Kathy has said, Mark 21 itself is struggling to accommodate more up-to-date standards such as RDA, and it's not just RDA, there's a source of problems from Mark 21. So a replacement is urgently needed. In terms of getting RDA to work with BibFrame, we're certainly monitoring the BibFrame initiative, and I contribute to the discussions on the listserv from time to time. But it seems to be still quite experimental and is certainly unstable. I don't mean it's falling apart, but I mean it's changing in fundamental areas. And until it becomes more stable in its underlying models, for example, the model was changed recently. It's quite difficult for RDA to work in any kind of level of specification or detail. We're certainly prepared for it, and as our BibFrame becomes more mature and settles in and becomes stable, then we'll certainly be looking to getting an RDA to interoperate with BibFrame. And this is one of the advantages of linked data. The linked data approach should make it relatively simple because of the level of granularity that the data is actually expressed in. it should be fairly simple for RDA to work with BibFrame and indeed any other linked data standard. There are certain rules. You don't get something for nothing, for example. You cannot improve the quality of your data if it's poor to begin with. But within those constraints, RDA and indeed BibFrame and any other bibliographic linked data standard should be able to interoperate with one another to a certain degree, depending on those constraints. The main difference that I can see and the main barriers at this stage, given the caveats that I've just expressed, the main issues I can see right now are that the BibFrame model collapses two of the RDA entities' work and expression into a single entity and thus reduces the level of granularity that it can support. And in general, it seems to be less granular than RDA. Although, again, it's difficult to tell because BibFrame is supposed to be extendable by RDA, but we're not really at that stage of testing these assumptions or developing anything that will actually work in practice. But generally speaking, and this is not a personal observation, it's been said by other people, BibFrame appears to, in a sense, occupy a level of detail which lies somewhere between RDA, which is very richly detailed because it uses the Ferber model, and Dublin Core, which is a high-level, fairly broad model intended to bring together that kind of data from many, many different communities. So that, I see, is the main difference between RDA and BibFrame at this stage and the kind of challenge that we face in the future.
Jamie, this might be a good time to bring in a couple of audience questions.
Sure.
We had one question. Someone asked, can Google read RDA? Read is in quotes. But that was a question that came up a couple times.
Okay. Anyone want to handle that one? Or?
Well, I suspect that the question is either highly technical and is referring to Google's ability to gather semantic or linked data, which I've just been describing. And currently, Google only recognizes a linked data schema called schema.org, which Google develops in conjunction with a couple of other major search engines. But because Google's scope is universal and global, books are a tiny, tiny, tiny part of Google's sphere of interest. Schema.org is a very, very broad schema for describing things, and it's certainly completely inadequate for the kinds of use that application that RDA and indeed BibFrame are intended for. So what we can do is we can map RDA metadata to schema.org. It loses a great deal of detail during that process because schema.org is so broad in scope. But it's certainly feasible to do so. And if large quantities of RDA data become available, they can be mapped to schema.org in exactly the same way that the current contents of WorldCat are mapped to schema.org. And that's what you see when you see the linked data output of WorldCat. It's not RDA, it's not BibFrame, it's schema.org. And it exists at quite a broad level, as I said, but certainly that would be what I think would happen in the future. And we could get Google to harvest RDA data and indeed any other kind of bibliographic metadata. These things require organization, though. It's not a simple matter of putting RDA records on the web and expect Google to harvest them. There's an awful lot of other detail involved, which requires a certain degree of organization. And for this to happen across a broad range, for the library community as a whole, for example, is certainly going to require at least national level frameworks for it to be practical.
Yeah, it's my impression that right now there are no quote-unquote local library systems that can handle the linked data that we envision as the future. So there's an area where we need to develop beyond our current ILSs, which are highly dependent on the MARC record structure, because that's what everyone's familiar with. But it's a dance here about customers need to say what they want. Vendors need to be developing things, but they need to support the old ways for the people who aren't ready to go. Who takes the lead, who follows. It's a very complex thing, and until there's something that's fairly stable that we can all identify that's the right thing to move to next, that's probably going to go pretty slowly unless there's someone out there who wants to do the experimenting and be a leader.
Sure, and we certainly, particularly through the RDA registry that Jamie mentioned at the beginning, we try to support developers through that kind of transition period. So we provide a number of tools that allow pure RDA data to interoperate with non-RDA data in applications, for example, and linked data applications. And we hope developers will eventually use these tools to make that transition from a MARC-based system into whatever linked data type systems emerge in the future. So we do the best that I think that we can to help people through this transition period. Having said that, I think it's worthwhile pointing out that the limitations of the current systems actually affect not just RDA, but virtually any metadata schema beyond MARC 21. So as libraries increasingly need to bring in data from other sources, from related domains such as archives and museums, publishers' metadata, for example, the current systems are beginning to be less and less effective because they are based on such old concepts. So this isn't just a challenge for RDA, this is a challenge for the vendor community as a whole, it seems to me.
Dan, did you have a second question?
Sorry, my microphone was muted there. Yeah, we've got some more questions coming in. I know this is something we were planning to discuss later, but someone asked about rare books and manuscripts. I'm sorry, that was on Twitter. Does RDA address copy-specific information, especially for rare books and manuscripts?
That's an area that we're definitely starting to reach out into, and we're talking to people in the archive and special collections community. We actually did a Jane-a-thon recently about that subject in Edinburgh, Gordon's hometown. Gordon, you want to talk kind of how that Jane-a-thon went and where we're at with those issues?
Sure. The Jane-a-thon did its Jane-a-thon thing and exposed the limitations of RDA in tackling rare book items, but it was intended to. In association with that Jane-a-thon, which wasn't specifically looking at rare books per se, but Robert Louis Stevenson said its first editions are rare enough. But there was also a full-day international seminar which was held in conjunction with the JSC meeting. And that was capacity. There was over 70 people at that from, I think, 19 different countries. And they were discussing the RDA treatment of rare materials. And we're certainly receiving all the feedback from that. And in addition, the CCDA task force on the second edition of the descriptive cataloguing of rare materials has firmly placed that within the RDA kind of infrastructure. So we expect DCRM2 to be embedded within the toolkit as a kind of extension to RDA, a kind of policy statement. But in general, it will not be replicating what RDA already says. So it will be a true embedding and integration of the descriptive cataloguing of rare materials with RDA. And that's not to say that the process then finishes. We will be setting up we're setting up a specific working group to carry this forward, and we expect to make announcements about that group by the end of the month. It does contain some of the members of the old CCDA task force, for example, but it has more international representation on it as well. And we will be looking at that work in conjunction with the other things that are going on with RDA and hoping to improve and develop RDA's ability to describe and access these rare materials. One of the drivers for this is not coming from within the library world, but from outside, because rare materials are far more prevalent in museum documentation, for example. And one of our strategies is to extend RDA for use within that particular community of the museum community. So we're expecting there to be quite a focus on item level description, if you want to call it that, over the next couple of years. And certainly the ball has already started rolling, and we're beginning to see improvements in RDA with each new release.
I might expand on this topic too, in that one of the changes in RDA that's going on right now is some changes in the governance and the processes which we use to evaluate RDA, including creation of several working groups on specific with specific tasks. And you know, they do look at things like these working groups try to tackle specific problems like rare materials or aggregates or music cataloging. In fact, Kathy, maybe you want to talk about what RDA how RDA has been addressing specific issues in the music cataloging.
Sure, I can go there because music is my specialty. First, let me just correct one thing that Gordon said. I wouldn't expect Gordon to have full depth understanding of the crazy ALA structures. It's not a CCDA task force on rare materials. It's an RBMS sponsored. So it's actually people who do a lot of real hands-on rare book stuff, and they're very well organized.
It's just a body name issue from
yeah, exactly. It's just one set of initials versus another. The music community has been very active in making RDA function for music and to have a long list of improvements, areas which need further discussion. This happened during RDA development and has continued. The Music Library Association has more or less been the host of that group through the years, although there are certainly participants outside of MLA, specifically Canadians and the Library of Congress. And as we moved to improve the internationalization of working groups, there are now at least one European and possibly more than one European member of what is now the RSC Music Working Group. They have a multi-year plan of things that were identified during RDA development and have been identified since RDA development to bring forward, and I believe they're our most active working group in terms of putting forward proposals for the JSC and now the RSC to consider to enhance and improve music instructions. The working group is, I think, probably 10 to 12 members. They are incredibly active, very thoughtful people, and are very passionate about what they do. One of the challenges that the international body has in evaluating information from specialists who are very clear on what they need is to make sure that RDA meets the needs both of the generalists and the specialists. So it's been very useful in discussions to have the generalists looking at these instructions, which to me make perfect sense because I've been a music cataloger for nearly 30 years. I don't necessarily recognize when I'm slipping into jargon or that there's some sort of terminology that is less than clear if you haven't spent that kind of time working with these resources. So it's one of the things that the working groups do have everything vetted at the international level to make sure that they make sense and fit into the overall content and language of RDA. But it's this reliance that we have. There's no way you want the RSC to be writing the instructions in any specialized area. We are there to oversee the development of RDA, not to get into the weeds about exactly what's what. And we all bring different skills and backgrounds to the experience. So it's better that we're the sort of the final signing off body than the actual creating the instructions body.
Thanks, Kathy. And I think you kind of, one of the things that you talked about, or has kind of emerged in this past conversation, is the increasing international aspects of RDA. And as RDA kind of seeks to not only improve opportunities for library data to kind of get out into the digital world, it's also trying to improve the ability for people to exchange data across international boundaries and across languages. I think it's a key aspect of RDA that we've been working towards. And I would add that currently the toolkit has translations of RDA. RDA is written in English, but it's been translated to French, German, Spanish, and Finnish. We're going to add Italian next month. We're in the process of adding Catalan. And we have many queries. I've been talking with folks at the Arabic Union Catalog in Saudi Arabia about doing at least a partial translation into Arabic. So this translation aspect of it and participation across all borders is a huge part of what can make RDA a success and make library data and information accessible to people all over the world. It's a really important component of what we're doing here.
And it's one of the things that I think it's hard for those of us who are enmeshed in MARC to understand how this internationalization works. Those of us who use OCLC see that OCLC has expanded beyond English language records, and most of us don't find Danish or German or whatever other language records all that helpful. Especially, we shouldn't be bringing them into our catalogs unless that's the language community that we're serving. So we see that, and we don't really understand how this shared data stuff works when it's not in a language that we understand. But this comes back to the power of linked data, which maybe, Gordon, you can talk a little bit about how the fact that how can I use a German language data set and still have it be meaningful to my end users?
Sure, and in fact, it's not 100% confirmed yet, but the next Jane-a-thon on US soil, which will not be an official Jane-a-thon, but will be held the day before ALA Annual in Orlando, will actually be addressing this very issue. We're going to call it Langathon or something like that, and it will be looking at the different issues associated with multilingual environments. So this is fresh on my mind because I was discussing the organization of this earlier today. So first of all, the linked data aspect. One of the great boons of linked data is that everything's identified by a machine-readable label, the URI, and rather than by human-readable labels, because human-readable labels come in many different shapes and forms, including translations. And so linked data allows us to refer to something with a URI, but actually display it in multiple languages if the data is attached to the URI. And that's something that we're actually doing in RDA registry. And Jamie's mentioned the languages in the toolkit, but it's an official RDA policy that any translation in the toolkit is also added to the registry. And that's where this power of linked data becomes apparent. And furthermore, we can accept translations in the registry that are not in the toolkit. So, for example, we've recently started to add a Chinese translation, and we should be able to add many, many more translations of the registry than there are of the toolkit. The important thing about this is what is being translated in the registry is all the stuff that the developer needs to express RDA data for their application. But that's just one aspect of a multilingual environment, a global information exchange environment. RDA also reduces abbreviations. This has an impact on the language of the catalog. Instead of using these Latin abbreviations of AACR2, for example, we now say things like date not determined, or instead of no date or n dot d dot. I know I haven't got that right. Kathy will correct me. However, an Italian agency can say the same thing in Italian, or a Spanish agency can say the same thing in Spanish. And so these abbreviations become far more user-friendly and for the local users in that language. Another aspect of multilingualism, and it's something that certainly I think has been detected in WorldCat recently, is that as more and more translations get added to large aggregations like WorldCat, you get more and more languages represented, obviously, but you get more and more parallel language elements. So you might have in a single record a parallel statement of responsibility, both in the original English and in French and German, for example. And this is to do with another area that we're interested in, which is transcribing information as it's presented on a manifestation. So there are a number of different structures and different contexts where non-English appears in a catalog aimed at English users. And one of the great utilities of RDA and a linked data approach and the granularity of the Ferber approach, and this I think is where work and expression as separate entities becomes very important in a multilingual environment, because translations are described at the expression level against a single work. I think all of these things, allow applications using RDA data in a multilingual environment to select, where a choice exists, the language that is familiar to the user. And what I hope, and I think this is one of the great hopes for linked data, is this multilingual capability will allow applications to switch the language at will. So a user should be able to say, I'm speaking French, I just want to see stuff where appropriate, only in French. So a catalog for a particular library need not be any longer in one language. It should be able to present what data it has, what data it can link to, what data it can gather in the language of the user, and not necessarily the language of the cataloging agency itself. So I think this is quite exciting, as you can probably tell, and I'm really looking forward to this this kind of informal Jane-a-thon, looking at this in a much more practical kind of environment.
And part of what Gordon brings up here is the importance of strings versus things, for those of you who've been to linked data presentations and have heard that before. When it's a thing and it's just a character string, then that's not going to be able to be translated. But if you can link to something else that then has a set of translated terms, then whatever the appropriate term for your user group can be displayed.
Dan, did you have any new questions for us? Dan, you're muted.
We did have another question. Yeah, Google told me I was muted too. We did have another question come in over Twitter. Michael asked, has anyone studied the impact of RDA on public libraries, whether lack of funds, staff training, or whether it would create a public catalog mess? He did put mess in quotes, is inherent with RDA.
I'm not aware of anything off the top of my head, but one of the important development considerations early on in RDA was that RDA data had to play well with AACR2 data. That we're moving away from some of those constraints now, but we recognize that, well, right now anything that you call RDA is almost certainly going to be put into MARC in a production environment. So as long as it's MARC data, it should play with the other MARC data, and it really shouldn't matter. I would assume public libraries are either intentionally or unintentionally bringing in RDA records, because that's what most of our original cataloging done by institutions now is mostly done as RDA. So the first library in that creates an RDA record, the the next libraries are going to be bringing that in and probably not changing it back to AACR2. So I don't know that there's too much of a mess. It's just that it's not realizing, back to our earlier comments, it's not realizing its full potential.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's just before Gordon speaks, I just add that what Gordon mentioned about the Jane-a-thon and what they're kind of exploring there. I mean, that's a use case for public libraries, cities with very diverse populations that need to serve that group. You know, that the multilingualism that we're bringing to RDA will actually be a big benefit to those groups and improve that. Cataloging, the cataloging structure that they can offer their patrons. Go ahead, Gordon.
Yeah, sure. And in addition to that point, and certainly larger cities, larger public libraries, I think, are increasingly facing the challenges of servicing polyglot communities. And this multilingual aspect is going to be extremely useful for them in the future. And I think the other advantages for public libraries lie, for example, in the potential for RDA to interact with publisher metadata and actually reduce costs. So we're beginning to see some signs, actually more over here in the UK than in the US, of publisher metadata certainly going into the National Library infrastructure because of copyright deposit legislation, and that's now been extended to digital publications. So we're beginning to see the impact of publisher-supplied metadata for digital publications. This is relevant because the quantity of digital publications is orders of magnitude greater than that for print. For example, a publisher will supply metadata for serials at article level rather than at title level, which is a huge difference between electronic and print. So as well as interoperability with publisher metadata, which can often is adequate to fulfill some public library functions, there's also the potential for interacting with other local communities. So, you know, a local archive, a local museum, for example, can also use the kind of cultural heritage aspects of RDA to improve services to their community through that. And I think there are a number of other ways that public libraries can benefit. That's not to say this is a period of transition, and periods of transition are always more difficult if you have fewer and fewer resources to smooth the way. And during a period of transition, the big guys, the big libraries are going to find it far easier to get through because they have more resources and they have bigger mass. Public libraries, I think, will suffer here, but as I stress, this is not a result of RDA. This is a result of the transition from our current metadata systems to those required in the future.
Jamie, we've had a couple of questions about authority control and how much focus there is on authority control in the RDA environment, particularly with regard to personal names. So I'm wondering if we can speak to that a little bit.
Well,
sure,
I guess,
but not me.
I was going to say, I'll volunteer because you might remember my title is Authorities and Specialty Cataloging Head. So I'm a NACO participant. I'm independent in NACO, and I review everyone's authority records here. My view of authority work in RDA in the environment that we're in now is it's taking greater importance than bibliographic description. Some of the changes that I mentioned earlier to MARC 21 have been to add fields for greater granularity in authority records. So we're no longer just using authority records to justify a particular character string to identify a person, but we're adding information about that person if we care to. Specific birth and death dates, for example, or occupation, field of activity. One that's somewhat controversial is the opportunity to encode gender. Fuller form of name can be formed separately from what might be in a MARC 100 in an authority record. And so it starts creating a record not just about the name, but about the person. And I personally find this really useful when I come back to a record and trying to identify, is this really the same person or not? The more, just because somebody has the same name doesn't mean it's the same person. The more information that's in the existing authority record about this person wrote on botany, or this person lived in Rome, or whatever, suddenly I'm able to see, well, no, this isn't the same person, because the person I have is a pianist who was born in Berlin, and therefore it's not the same as this botanist who was born in Rome. And yes, I could do the information digging behind the scenes and get that same information. It just saves me a step as a cataloger if that information's already in the authority record. And I do think that recording this richness of data, as we do more and more of it, the fact that the data is there allows us to start doing other things with that data, potentially. So yes, we'd have to have systems, or we'd have to have links where we can start seeing relationships. Depends on how rich you encode your data, what you then can do with it. The potential would be to query the authority file and say, let me find 20th century Spanish authors who were, born in Madrid, and give me a list. And that could be a really powerful research tool, one that would not require the creation of another reference work, for example.
All right. Well, we're getting to the end of our time, so I think this would be a good time for some closing thoughts. So, James, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, I hope people found this conversation worthwhile and enlightening. We're very excited about the direction that RDA is heading and the projects that we have underway, and feel that they can be, we've set up a new governing structure that is particularly open and responsive to any kind of input that we can get from the community on RDA. And I'll let Kathy and Gordon share their own closing thoughts.
I wasn't exactly prepared to share closing thoughts, okay. But that's all right. I am the ALA representative to the RDA Steering Committee, and if you have questions coming out of this or other questions related to RDA that you would like to bounce my way, please feel free to do so. My email address is kglennan, KGLENNAN, at UMD, University of Maryland.edu, and I'd be happy to hear from you.
And you can always also approach me as chair directly, although for any kind of substantive North American development, you would then be redirected to Kathy. But if you have comments or suggestions, for example, for strategic developments, etc., I would be more than happy to hear them. If you find it easier just to email directly or expose it on RDAL or whatever. I'll just echo Jamie's concluding remarks. We've changed our governance structure. It's undergone a radical overhaul to make RDA more responsive to its users at international level. And we know that the North American community has been the powerhouse behind the development of RDA, and we sincerely hope the North American community will remain one of the primary drivers making RDA better for everybody, not just in the US, but well beyond its borders and around the rest of the world.
All right. Well, we're just about at the end of our time, so I will thank our panel, James, Kathy, and Gordon. You guys were fantastic. Thank you all so much for your insights. And I want to thank our audience for all the great questions and comments. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to every single one, but I hope you found the event insightful. And we'll be talking about ebooks and audiobooks next month. So again, thanks, and we hope everyone has a great day, and we'll see you back next month.